Today, we're talking about deductions versus compliance fines. We have lovely Ryan Petty with us here today. Oh, Hominoki. Ooh, that's very good. That's a very good choice, Ryan. Okay, so Ryan, he is our senior product manager over here at SupplyPike. He leads our OTIF radar product, a lot of the product development for that, as well as our deduction solution. So he is the perfect person to compare deductions versus compliance fines for us here today. Super excited to have him. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Okay, today we are going to be talking about all things compliance and deductions with Walmart. So we're going to do a quick overview, then dive into Walmart AP deductions versus OTIF fines versus SQEP, and then do some examples for each of those different ways that you can get fined at Walmart. So at the end, we are going to reserve some time to talk about questions. But if you have been with us here today, you know that we're getting a lot of questions for a lot of these different webinars. So please submit your questions in early and we will take those as they're coming in, but also make sure that we reserve some time. All right, so just if this is the first time you've joined us here today, will you get a copy of the slide deck? Yes, you will. You'll actually get a copy of the entire recording and slide deck of the entire conference for today. So you'll see that in your inbox. It'll take us about 3 to 4 business days. What is the best way to ask a question? It's going to be those 2 little chat bubbles down at the bottom that say Q&A. You please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function, just because it is kind of difficult whenever there's a lot of questions going in there, a lot of discussion for us to kind of parse through those. So best way to do it is with the Q&A. All right, who is SupplyPike? So if you guys are not familiar, if you haven't joined us here today, SupplyPike, we are a software company and we build solutions to help you recover revenue that may have been lost due to retailers. So retailers, eating into your bottom line, we help you recover that and, make sure that your revenue is staying nice and juicy like it should be. So we've worked with over 400 different CPGs. We've helped recover over $25 billion in retail impact, and we have actually been in over 50 different product categories. I think that number is actually a little bit more now since we're in multiple different retailers: Walmart, Target, Amazon, Kroger, all of the fun ones. These are some of the brands we work with. And yeah, that is SupplyPike. And now I'm going to hand it over to you, Ryan.
Yeah. All right. Well, congrats to everyone who's been sticking around. Hopefully we'll provide some value here with especially the compliance side, but we are going to cover some AP deductions, but we'll try to focus a little bit more on compliance since we've covered a bit more of deductions today. But to start, we want to talk about kind of what are the common types of chargebacks from Walmart. So one, you have deductions. These are sort of code-based. Walmart's AP team is going to pay one of your invoices and they feel they need to withhold payment of that invoice or partial payment for various reasons. Compliance fines, on the other hand, are typically related to supply chain performance, where it's more punitive and Walmart is fining you for not performing well enough for all kinds of reasons now. So we'll get into sort of the details of that as we go forward. So again, just to recap, deductions are where Walmart is subtracting from your payment, the payment of your invoice from Walmart. So they're subtracting. Compliance fines are sort of bills that they are creating. They're creating their own invoices and issuing those invoices to you. Typically, those are not paid back. They're sort of balanced against future payments and reduce future payments as well. So kind of similar, but they are invoices from Walmart to start. So chargebacks. So in these 2 categories, deductions and compliance fines. On the deduction side, you typically have things like allowances, price discrepancies, merchandise-related codes, short shipping codes, all of those types of, two-digit codes that we've talked about earlier today. Whereas on the compliance fine side, we have these wonderful chargebacks from the OTIF compliance program and the new SQEP or SQEP, or however you prefer to say it, program that's now finding you for other parts of that supply chain process. So some more details on this, just to sort of make it sure it's crystal clear. The deductions are coming off a payment of your invoice. These deductions can be disputed and they can be recovered. Again, some examples of these codes, 22, 24, 25, but there are, many dozens of codes to keep track of. These are disputed through Walmart's accounts payable dispute portal, or APDP. Compliance fines, on the other hand, are invoices from Walmart. And they can be anything from how you package and ship the product to whether it was received on time or in full. You can get SQEP and OTIF fines on the same POs. You can even have deductions on the same PO. So these really can stack up on top of each other. With OTIF and SQEP, they can now be disputed in HighRadius. You may also have some success, especially with OTIF, disputing with your buyer, but we'll talk more about the details of that and which to use a little bit later. Okay, so disputing Walmart deductions, we just want to highlight a few apps in Retail Link that are most important. So number one, Accounting Scorecard gives you kind of a barometer of your invoices that you've sent to Walmart and statuses, invoice accuracy, some of those other details in that Accounting Scorecard. APIS or APIS is where you can view invoices and claims, which are essentially those deductions against your invoices. You've got payment data, invoice data, claim data, the checks that are actually issued. All of that is in that APIS app or APIS. APDP, another accounts payable app, accounts payable dispute portal. That is where you now go to dispute those AP deductions. It used to be done in an app called Direct Commerce. Now it is all done in APDP to dispute those AP deductions. So on that note, what do you need to dispute? This definitely differs a lot across the types of deductions, especially when Walmart has dozens of deduction codes. The requirements to dispute and when each one definitely vary a lot. But some of the most important documents most commonly used for disputing are, related proofs of delivery, bills of lading. Of course, those documents being signed is very important. A copy of your invoice to Walmart, the purchase order sometimes can be helpful. And then supplier agreements often include things about, shipping terms, allowances, other things that could impact deductions that you are receiving. So that supplier agreement can sometimes be quite helpful. Okay, now when we talk about claims with Walmart, these deductions where they are not paying you in full, I'm going to go through some highlights kind of what's on the claim and what you'll need to dispute. So the claim number is generally going to be the invoice number to Walmart, especially if it is a deduction on one of your invoices. The claim date is when Walmart kind of creates that claim. It's not the check date or the invoice date. It is actually the claim date, its own date. And then dispute type is something that you have to kind of select and understand what it should be based on the store or DC that you delivered to, and whatever type of location that is will sort of change what dispute type you should submit with a dispute. So claim code, I've talked about, there's a lot of different codes, things like 22, 24, 25, and many, many more. So that is going to tell you what the reason for the deduction is. And if you are looking at a specific claim, you generally want to dispute all of the claim codes on that claim. So if there's different items with that claim code, you should dispute those together if it's the same code. Disputed amount. So this is another sort of best practice onto how to dispute. We suggest disputing the full claim amount of that code so that you can have better success at getting a successful dispute and one that you win. So even if you're not intending to dispute the full amount or you don't think the full amount is invalid, we still recommend to put that full amount on there, and then Walmart can, just pay you for the part that ultimately ends up as invalid. Some other info, other data points, your vendor number, 6-digit vendor number must be on the dispute, and purchase order number, of course. The freight carrier is optional, but you can include it if you know it. The location, this is something that may be required, but not always. But this would generally be, where the claim came from. So if it's a store or a DC that was receiving that order, then that's going to be that location. The shipping method, generally prepaid or collect. If you're not sure, then collect is the best one to choose. And then lastly, when you're filling out these disputes, the description is asked for. It is optional, and we don't typically see any, results based on whether you do or do not fill it out or how you fill it out. So we suggest keep this kind of short, as it doesn't seem to be very relevant in the outcome of the dispute. Okay, so in terms of those additional data points to include on a dispute, shipping documents is definitely, especially for shortages, going to be the most important documents to attach. And you're proving that the items were actually shipped. That's the goal of having these documents included. So depending on how you ship, you may need a different document type. If you are collect and Walmart is picking the product up from your facility, then a signed bill of lading with a packing list, or at least with the item information on that bill of lading, is really crucial to disputing a shortage deduction if you're collect. Prepaid, on the other hand, you really want that proof of delivery or drop trailer stamp if you can't get it. But a signed proof of delivery is definitely best practice here to dispute a shortage on a prepaid order. So really important documents to have on these shortage disputes in particular. Just to go over some data points on the shipping documents. So ideally you have the ship to address so you can prove, where this order was going to. The PO number, of course, is required by Walmart to include on the BOL. Again, you want the item info so you can, reference that in your dispute and prove that it was actually picked up. And then again, that signature, which is very important because without a signature, it's not necessarily a real document that can be used. Proof of delivery, some similar data points on it that are important. Of course, again, ship to address, PO number, item info. If you can get that sort of stamped POD that shows that the order was received in full, that is absolutely best case scenario and what you'd like to have on any, especially prepaid order dispute. If you cannot get the POD, a drop trailer stamp is kind of the next best thing to have. So that's what we recommend in that scenario. Okay, so shipping documents we talked about. Another kind of data point that you may want to attach on these AP deduction disputes is the invoice. Of course, the invoice just helps clarify what you actually billed for each item, the quantity, the price per unit on that item, any allowances that may have been taken on the invoice or not taken will be kind of made visible with that invoice copy that you've submitted to Walmart, but now you're attaching in the dispute. So it's not necessarily required, but it helps, it seems to help improve outcomes and kind of speed up that research process on the Walmart side. Purchase order is another data point that you might consider attaching in your sort of document list on that dispute. This is not usually necessary, but in some cases it can help, especially sort of, understanding which items were ordered by Walmart at what price, what units. That kind of information would typically be on the PO and sometimes can be helpful, but usually it's not near as critical as those other two docs we just talked about. And then lastly, the supplier agreement. Talked about this as another document to attach. If you have kind of allowances or return deductions, then this is when this is most applicable. So you can reference that agreement to, kind of fight back on any invalid deduction that was taken that is outside of what you've agreed in that supplier agreement. So that's really helpful for those types of scenarios. Some other things that could be helpful: claim document itself. So just attaching a copy of kind of the full claim document where these deductions are shown is helpful. You can also attach things like packing slips and even reports from Retail Link. So if you're fighting something like a shortage, you could attach, for example, receiving reports from DSS, another Retail Link app, that shows, these goods were actually received. So that's a scenario that could be helpful. If there's returns info in Retail Link, you may want to attach it to a returns related deduction. And then lastly, buyer approval. If you have any deductions where the buyer may be of help in validating or confirming that that deduction is invalid, and you have that in an email, then that is, great proof to attach to your dispute to increase your chances at winning. So these are all things to consider attaching in your disputes and hopefully help you win more than you lose. And we did just want to make a note, and we'll reference it on the OTIF side too, but talking to your buyer, getting their sort of help in fighting these charges. Some things to consider. Of course, every buyer is different. Some of them are very busy. Some of them are not as busy maybe, and more likely to help. Some are less likely to help. So your mileage will likely vary when sort of working with your buyers and trying to get their help with charges or deductions. So just, keep in mind sort of how your relationship exists with your buyer. If they're not working very close with you and you seem to struggle to get responses, then maybe you don't want to hit them up all the time and you want to save those reach outs for more significant charges or deductions that you want their help on. So just keep that in mind as you kind of try to get help with your buyer. Try to sort of get the most bang for your buck out of those conversations when you reach out to that person at Walmart. Okay, and on that note, disputing OTIF fines with your buyer, let's talk about that. So OTIF actually had a little bit of a change in their dispute process this year. So early on this year, Walmart sort of slid in a small update to their OTIF FAQ and published this sort of one-line change of, are OTIF charges disputable? This question did not exist in their FAQ before this year, but they added it in and they said, yes, you can dispute in HighRadius. And there was just a very little additional detail, but not much. So the process is still a little bit unclear. We've learned a lot this year with working with suppliers at disputing OTIF charges. So looking forward to sharing some of those insights with you. But this was a change in that OTIF fine disputing world. It used to not have an official process. And we'll talk about, first, we're going to talk about what kind of the old process was that you may still be able to use today. And then we'll cover the new dispute process with HighRadius. So in terms of that old process, really, if you wanted to get OTIF fines reversed or disputed, your best bet was to work with your buyer to especially try to waive the fines before they were issued rather than disputing after the fact. There seemed to be the best chance at wiping these charges away if you could get them waived before they were issued. So we generally recommended talking with your buyer 1 to 2 weeks before the fine came out and kind of requesting their help in getting these fines waived, and sending them documentation and reasoning why. And if you were able to get those fines waived, then you avoid the fine and you don't have to dispute after the fact. So that is always a nice option if you can have success with that. I mentioned that all buyers are not made the same. So we've seen some departments and buyers where suppliers have had, pretty good success at working with their buyers to get invalid fines, especially waived. Sometimes if there were really extenuating circumstances, like there has been in the world the last 2-3 years at this point, there were some fine waivings that happened through this method of working with your buyer. But then other departments and buyers were a lot less receptive to this. So your mileage will vary here. And in terms of whether you should dispute with your buyer or through this new HighRadius dispute process, we get this question a lot. What I would say is that if you have success at getting fines waived with your buyer, then by all means continue to use it until that well runs dry. So if it's working, great. Keep doing it until proven otherwise. Sometimes we've seen some suppliers reach out to their buyer this year and get a response saying, this should be submitted in HighRadius. And if they come back and say that, then great, no harm, no foul. We can try the HighRadius dispute process. If you've never tried to dispute with your buyer, you could try it. If you have a good relationship with your buyer, if they're kind of responsive, then that's some good signs that there might be some luck with this method. But if they're not receptive or they haven't really got any fines reversed, then you might just want to kind of skip to the HighRadius process. But I did want to talk about this as one option to try to get fines reversed before they are issued, as we have seen some success at using this kind of method. So if you are going to go about disputing with your buyer, generally, you're going to send an email kind of with your OTIF fine waiving request, again, like 1 to 2 weeks before that fine is issued. So obviously you want to include some data like the PO numbers that you're disputing, what kinds of charges they have, and reasoning on why you're asking the fines to be waived. And it could be that Walmart, their data is wrong. It could be that their processes, impacted your performance, and you're going to kind of explain why these fines occurred and they should be waived. So your reasoning can be as imaginative as you are. So if you can put together a case that you think your buyer will be receptive to, then, it may be worth trying. And then lastly, obviously, you want to be clear about how much you're asking to be waived in that dispute request with your buyer. So hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea as to one way to go about to get these fines reversed. Up until this year, this was really the only method that you had to try to get OTIF fines reversed and waived, was with this process. So now we will talk about the new process. So this is all happening, this new dispute process, in an app called HighRadius. It is outside of Retail Link, but every Walmart supplier should have access to it. And we want to actually call out here where the data is located. So if you want to dispute, you have to do that in the HighRadius app, in Walmart's sort of HighRadius portal. So that's where you go to dispute. If you want to see your detailed performance data, your scores, which POs were non-compliant for what reasons, then that is going to still be inside of Retail Link in the OTIF Scorecard app, where you can get more details about OTIF performance. And specifically, this is what it looks like to open that OTIF Scorecard app in Retail Link. So once you log into it, you can go to your apps, and that's the name of the key OTIF app, On Time in Full OTIF Scorecard. So the data inside of that scorecard app, there's several things you can do based on that sort of visibility. Obviously, you want to understand the compliance issues that you contributed to. It's a little bit confusing if you're new to OTIF, because Walmart can have accountability for non-compliance. So those Walmart accountable issues do not count towards your fines or your score, but the supplier accountable issues do. So you want to focus in on those supplier accountable compliance issues. Of course, a major action item to do with OTIF performance is trying to figure out the why. Why did these POs fail at compliance, so that once you understand why, you can attempt to make changes to prevent those issues from happening in the future. You may even find that Walmart was to blame, or their data is inaccurate. And then you may want to dispute. So sometimes root cause is not going to lead to a prevention, it's going to lead to a dispute. Other things you can do with this data is, obviously you can sort of filter and export and try to present to your 3PLs or carriers or warehouses that you work with, and show them their detailed performance, so that you can kind of try to spread the accountability to the partners in your supply chain that control these specific processes. And that's a big part of OTIF root causing, is making issues visible to understand what to work on. And then disputing OTIF fines. There is data in the OTIF Scorecard app that you need to export in order to submit to HighRadius when you dispute. So you kind of have to use both apps. You've got to get data out of OTIF Scorecard and then plug that into your HighRadius dispute. So also useful for that. And on that note, HighRadius, we shared a little bit of visibility into what HighRadius looks like, since this is sometimes newer to folks who are digging into OTIF. So this is really meant to be an accounts receivable portal for Walmart suppliers. So this is where it's accounts receivable from Walmart's perspective. So they are publishing all of their invoices to you in this portal. So these are more like chargebacks. These are all of the OTIF fines, all of the SQEP fines, the new collect pickup program invoices, that sort of freight charge. Those are also posted in HighRadius. So all of those invoices from Walmart will be in HighRadius. And you can actually dispute in HighRadius. And so once you see those invoices, when you spot an OTIF fine or a SQEP fine, it's going to be one invoice per month per 6-digit vendor number. So you would select that row, and there is actually a dispute button in HighRadius to dispute. You would dispute that entire month within that one dispute. So any POs for SQEP or OTIF that you want to dispute, you would do it in one shot for that month. And the dispute window that you have, especially for OTIF, is 13 months. And I believe it is the same for SQEP as well. And that is typically based on how much data is loaded in that OTIF Scorecard app, where you're gathering the data to submit in this HighRadius dispute. So 13 months of invoices is what your window is to dispute. And just at a high level, in terms of, how to submit these disputes. So let's say you tried to dispute with your buyer. They were a no-go, they didn't respond, or they didn't choose to help you reverse that fine. So now you've actually been fined. Well, at this point, you still have the ability to dispute in HighRadius once that fine actually gets issued. That's sort of the second step of this process. If you want to do the most complete sort of, comprehensive dispute attempt and try to get every chance you possibly can, you can dispute with the buyer first and then dispute in HighRadius, but you do not have to dispute with the buyer. You could just skip to trying the dispute in HighRadius also. Okay, so if you're going to dispute in HighRadius, what should you include on your dispute? So this is where their details were really bare to start. They listed some kind of generic information to include things like screenshots, documentation, research, and communication with Walmart partners. So not real specific on what they are looking for when you submit that dispute. We'll talk about some other sort of data points that we know you need to include. And then this is something that is a little bit brand new that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. So we've been reviewing HighRadius disputes, both accepted and denied disputes. And what we've seen lately with some of these denials is they kind of list out, like, here's the data points that you need to include on your OTIF dispute just to even get them to review it in their various columns. But one additional data point that they've called out in the last few weeks is this OTIF buyer payback template. One thing that is not clear is whether this is actually required now going forward on all HighRadius OTIF disputes, or if this is kind of an optional template that if you have buyer approval to reverse a charge, then they want you to include that approval in this format. And so that's what we're trying to figure out right now, is, which is required. And the fun thing about watching these disputes over this entire year since this process has gone live is HighRadius, I think, has been adapting their own processes at what is required. We've seen their list of requirements change probably 4 or 5 times at least over these last 6-7 months on what is required in an OTIF dispute. So that's why we're always monitoring this and trying to share the latest that we know in these webinars and documentation. But this is sort of hot off the presses right now of this sort of template that they are requesting to be filled out in your buyer approval process. So if we talked about earlier, disputing with your buyer, if the fine has already been issued and you still want to dispute in HighRadius, you can still go to your buyer and say, HighRadius is requesting your approval to reverse these OTIF charges that are invalid. Here's why they're invalid. Here's the list of POs who wanted to reverse. And here's the template to fill out so that I can supply this to HighRadius. That's essentially what it seems like they're asking you as suppliers to do with the buyer. And I'm not sure why they've created more documentation and process around this, but hopefully this will just be kind of an optional thing and they'll still review OTIF disputes without it. But this is something new they've been mentioning. So if you see this, there's some links to the actual template, but on screen, you can kind of see what it looks like. Okay, so hopefully that sort of gives you some idea to disputing in HighRadius. The last thing we have on this is kind of the bare minimum of what you need to supply in a HighRadius OTIF dispute for them to even review it. So these are all columns of data that you can mostly find in the OTIF Scorecard app and retail link. So when you go to that Scorecard app, you can view your PO level data for a particular month. And there are many columns that you can pick from. These are the columns that they have requested you to include on your OTIF dispute. So 6-digit vendor number, the host PO number, the item numbers. So this, if you're disputing in full charges, you need to have this kind of at the line level where you have the item info included. And then charge type and charge amount are columns that actually don't exist in OTIF scorecard or exist with a different name. So you may have to tweak your file a little bit to fit their sort of column description. But those are pretty straightforward in terms of what they mean. Charge type would be the metric that you're disputing, for example, in full or prepaid on time, collect ready, etc. And then one more slide with these sort of required data points to include on your dispute. MABD is another column that you can include on that OTIF data. If you're disputing collect ready charges, then they want the late routing cases column and the supplier ship point case columns. The delivery window, if you're disputing prepaid on time charges, and then any PO change or cancel reason code columns. So it's not very fun to build sort of this format of file, but this is specifically what HighRadius asks to be included on any OTIF dispute. So unfortunately, even though it's sort of time consuming and tedious, you need to have these data points. Otherwise, they will reject it and say you're missing information, and they won't even really review, whether this was an invalid or valid charge. They'll just stop their review and reject it and kick it back to you. And you may have to wait weeks for them to even sort of kick it back. So it can be tedious and time consuming if you don't give them what they want, from the beginning. Okay, so wanted to cover a little bit more of identifying these invoices and the dispute process in HighRadius. So when you open HighRadius, the first two tabs on the left are open and closed bills. If it's an open bill, it basically means these are typically more recent charges that have not yet been applied to a payment. So they haven't really applied that charge to any of outgoing payments. The closed bills are ones that have been applied. The good thing is that, you can dispute either invoices from either tab. So you just really have to find out which one it's in. Older OTIF months are going to be in that closed bills, and the most recent OTIF invoice may still be in open, but otherwise you can dispute the same way through both tabs. And what it looks like to dispute is when you identify that chargeback, whether it's a SQEP fine or an OTIF fine, you would check that row in that bills tab, and then you see that kind of list of light blue buttons right above the list. Over on the far right is a dispute button. So you check the invoice you want to dispute, you click on that dispute button. You can select more than one at a time, but I would just recommend doing one at a time for simplicity, but HighRadius does seem to allow you to select multiple. But usually the data you're supplying is different per invoice, so may not make as much sense to do multiple at a time, but it is technically possible, it appears. So once you click on the dispute button, you'll get this modal to fill out information and a few sort of data points to fill out. So number one, dispute reason. Just a little bit of a pro tip: if you're disputing an OTIF charge, they always want you to select incorrect billing. There's a few options that you have in this dropdown. None of them are very relevant to OTIF. So it's not really, the reason for your dispute or anything like that. It's just a step you have to do. So if you're disputing OTIF and HighRadius, I strongly recommend you to select incorrect billing for that dispute reason. That seems to be what they want you to fill out. And then amount to be disputed, of course, is the dollar amount you're disputing. Comments, if you want to attach any reasoning for why you're filling out the dispute, or why the charges are invalid, you can attach those in the comments. I wouldn't recommend going too crazy in those comments, as we don't think it influences the outcome too much, but at least some context as to why the dispute is there could be helpful. And then lastly, attachments for relevant documents. So attachments is where you definitely want to attach that Excel file that you downloaded from the OTIF Scorecard app. So all those columns we talked about, including MABD, PO numbers, item numbers, vendor numbers, etc. All of that in that Excel file, that's what you at a minimum have to attach to this dispute just to get them to review it. And then, of course, you can attach additional kind of relevant documents to back up your dispute if you have that. And then lastly, once you filled it out, they've got a save button in the bottom right corner. And so, make sure you click on save to actually submit that dispute. And then that will create the dispute, and then you can track it from there. And where you would track those disputes is in the disputes tab in HighRadius. So you would click on that and you'll see a list of disputes where you can look up the progress, their statuses. There's also a column, you can kind of see it on this screenshot. It's the next to last column on the right side called deduction notes. So if you get a rejected or approved dispute in HighRadius, typically they will add some feedback in that deduction notes column. It's usually just a link and you click on it and it shows you the related comments. And that can be helpful to understand why they rejected it, or if it's approved, you can actually sometimes see how much they approved it for and when it would be paid back. So the deduction notes and the status are kind of usually the most important columns in that disputes tab, along with just the invoice number, so you can track which dispute that invoice is related to. Okay, so some scenarios of why you would dispute. I mentioned earlier, if you're disputing with your buyer, it's really up to you as to what you think is worthy of disputing. There's no official definition of what an invalid fine is. So if you've been impacted by something that Walmart has done, if you think Walmart's data is incorrect, if you've been impacted by crazy circumstances outside of your control, weather obviously is one that happens a lot and can impact you, among other things, then those are all reasons on why you might dispute. So some scenarios that we've laid out here that we've seen some success with, as well as sort of consistent challenges across suppliers. So first one, if you're prepaid, we hear a lot about, DCs don't have appointment availability to schedule your appointment in the MABD window. And it's a struggle to schedule when Walmart doesn't have any appointments available. So that's a scenario where if you can show, we tried to schedule in the window, but there were none available, that's a scenario you could dispute. If you're collect, on the other hand, usually the problem is that Walmart fails to pick up, or they send you a truck with, half the trailer filled up and you need the full trailer. So those kinds of scenarios can cause late routings if you have to route again, if they miss a pickup, and you can get fined because of sort of Walmart's truck's performance. So no matter if you're prepaid or collect, there are always sort of failure points where, you're a little bit out of luck. So those are scenarios you can dispute. We also see, especially on the in full side, discrepancies in Walmart systems. So sometimes DSS will show a PO was received in full, But OTIF does not. OTIF says there's a shortage and you've now been fined for it. So that's a good discrepancy to highlight and dispute. You may also want to dispute discrepancies between your ASN data, what you ship to Walmart, and Walmart's received data as well. So that's another scenario you could potentially dispute. And then again, inclement weather, crazy, world circumstances that are outside of your control are maybe other reasons to dispute. I would say you may have more success with that type of dispute with your buyer than HighRadius. From what we've seen, HighRadius is more accounting like. They're not necessarily sympathetic listener to supply chain challenges. They're more data driven. If there's a clear data reason to reverse a fine, then we see some success with HighRadius. But if you have sort of crazy circumstances, then your buyer is probably going to be more sympathetic to that than sort of the dispute review personnel with HighRadius. And just had a note on here to communicate issues with Walmart team as they come up. That's, I think, particularly useful when and if you are disputing with your buyer. If you tell them there are, some real supply chain challenges going on or weather events that have impacted you, then when you go to try to get that fine waived or, disputed after the fact, you can kind of reference what you talked about earlier. And it's not a total surprise, and the buyer is aware of it, and maybe they're going to be more receptive to helping you reverse that charge at that point. So pretty much exactly what I just said on this slide, that documentation, communicating along the way, these all create paper trails of, what happened, what you did along the way. And again, especially disputing with your buyer, that can be really helpful. But sometimes with HighRadius as well. Kind of same scenarios here. So already kind of covered this. We'll skip right past that one. And I did want to provide an example of kind of a real HighRadius dispute that was partially approved in this case. This is this exact scenario we've seen multiple approvals with. We've also seen rejections for it, but we have seen some success at disputing this scenario. So in this case, it was a not in full fine that was issued, and out of that overall not in full fine, we compared the OTIF received cases to what was received according to DSS. And there was a discrepancy. And that discrepancy where DSS shows the cases were received compared to OTIF, just those cases resulted in like a $3,500, OTIF fine for that month. And sometimes, obviously, depending on the size of business that you have with Walmart, this is going to vary a lot. But in this case, it was like $3,400. They submitted to HighRadius. HighRadius appeared to review, the list of POs that was different, and they approved about a third of them. And it's not exactly always logical as to why they approve some and not others. But, I think from our perspective, if Walmart's own data is showing these cases are received, but they're not in OTIF, this is probably a more winnable scenario than some other scenarios that you could dispute. So wanted to highlight this because we've seen a little bit more success at disputing this particular scenario. So something to consider if you're receiving a lot of kind of invalid, not in full fines. If you can use Walmart's data, as sort of your own proof, then that's a great spot to be in. And, I think a buyer, if you were going to dispute with your buyer in advance and try that route, they're also potentially going to be more receptive to helping you out when you can make that logical argument and say, look, these cases were received in DSS, but we got all these fines in OTIF for them. So hopefully just one sort of insight to help you dispute and fight some of these invalid charges. And Melody, I think that does it for our last session. except for our Q&A.
Well, Ryan, I have some news for you. We don't have any questions. I
Wow.
haven't seen any come through chat. So we just kind of breeze through that. Are you guys all brain dead? Is that what's happened? We're just exhausted and we're like, all right, we're ready to end Decoded. I'm going to give you guys like 30 more seconds. If I don't see anything come through the chat, then we will end our Decoded conference. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this full day. This is the first time we've ever done it. So we will be sending a feedback survey out after this. Please let us know. Let us know what you thought. Let us know, what we can do better for next time. Love your all's feedback. So thank you so much, everyone who joined with us today. Thank you, Ryan, for being on so many different sessions. Really appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Hopefully we'll see you guys again soon.